The silence of the mountains was a physical weight, pressing down on the roof of the log cabin, seeping through the chinks in the walls that Caleb had long ago sealed with mud and moss. It was a silence he had sought, a vast and empty cathedral where the only sermons were the groan of pine trees under snow and the distant howl of a lone wolf. For 5 years this silence had been his sanctuary, a balm for a wound that refused to scar over. But now, with the first deep snows of winter blanketing the high passes, the quiet had begun to curdle. It had become a hollow ache in his chest, an echo of his own solitude. He was a huge man, built of the same rock and timber as his surroundings, with a thick mane of dark hair and a beard that fell to his chest, both streaked with the first hints of gray. His hands, calloused and wide, could split a log with a single swing of the axe, yet they fumbled with the simple task of frying salt pork without burning it to a crisp. The loneliness he could endure. The poorly cooked food was becoming a trial. That was why the sign was there, hammered into the frozen ground at the turnoff to his remote ranch. A single plank of wood with 2 words crudely painted in pitch: "Cook wanted." It was a desperate, foolish gesture. No sane person would venture this high for such a meager post, not with winter tightening its grip. He expected nothing to come of it, yet every morning he looked toward the path, a flicker of something he refused to name as hope dying a little more with each empty sunrise. The mountains demanded resilience, and he had it in abundance, but they also demanded a will to live that went beyond mere survival, and that, he was discovering, was a thing best shared. He saw her on his way back from checking his trap lines, a small, impossible splash of color against the endless white and gray. At first he thought she was an apparition, a trick of the cold air on his eyes. But as he drew closer, his heavy footsteps muffled by the snow, the shape resolved into a person, a young woman, sitting perfectly still on the frozen earth beside the base of his sign. She was wearing a thin prairie dress, the color of a faded sunset, a pale and delicate pink that was an affront to the brutal landscape. Her hair was a sheet of black ink against the fabric, and her hands were clasped in her lap. But it was her feet that held his gaze, that made the cold air in his lungs feel like a shard of glass. They were bare, resting on the snow, their skin a mottled, terrifying shade of blue. She did not look up as he approached, her stillness absolute, as if she had grown there, a strange and fragile mountain flower blooming in the heart of winter. He stopped a few feet away, the dead rabbits slung over his shoulder suddenly feeling obscene in their vitality. He was a man accustomed to the harsh realities of life and death, but this quiet, deliberate surrender to the cold unnerved him. He cleared his throat, the sound loud and grating in the profound silence. "What are you doing here?" His voice was a rusty thing, unused to forming questions. She finally lifted her head, and her eyes, dark and deep, met his. There was no fear in them, only a profound and bottomless exhaustion. Her lips, chapped and pale, parted slightly. "Cook," she whispered, the word a tiny puff of white in the freezing air, before her eyes rolled back and she slumped sideways into the snow. He carried her back to the cabin, her slight frame a shock against his own bulk. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of cold limbs and brittle bones wrapped in a foolish pink dress. Inside, the warmth from the stone hearth was a living thing, and he laid her down on the bearskin rug before it, his movements clumsy and uncertain. He had not touched another human being in 5 years. The feeling was alien, terrifying. He chafed her hands and feet, the skin frighteningly cold, until a flicker of life, a weak protest of a moan, escaped her lips. He wrapped her in his thickest wool blanket, tucking it around her until only her face was visible, small and pale against the dark gray wool. For hours he sat in his chair, watching her, the stew he'd planned to make forgotten in its pot. He was a man who knew how to handle a cornered bear, how to track a deer for days, how to read the sky for a coming storm. He did not know what to do with a half-frozen Chinese girl who had appeared at his doorstep like a piece of wind-blown silk. He saw the dark bruises on her arms when he had first lifted her, the faded scars on her ankles. This was not a simple case of getting lost. This was an escape. From what, he could only imagine, and his imagination, fueled by the grim stories that trickled up from the railroad camps and mining towns, was a dark place. He was a man who had built a fortress of solitude to keep the world out, and now the world, in its most vulnerable and complicated form, was lying by his fire. He should take her to the settlement as soon as she was well enough to travel. It was the sensible thing to do, the right thing to do. But when he looked at her, so fragile in the flickering firelight, the thought of delivering her to the suspicious, hostile glares of the townsfolk felt like a betrayal. He stoked the fire, the rasp of iron on stone the only sound, and resigned himself to waiting. She woke near dawn. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was filled with long, deep shadows. Caleb was asleep in his chair, his head slumped to his chest, the rifle he always kept close resting against his knee. The girl, An Lee, pushed herself up slowly, her body a single, deep ache. The blanket was heavy and smelled of wood smoke, pine, and the man who watched her from the chair. She looked at her feet, now swaddled in strips of clean linen he must have torn from a shirt. They throbbed with a fiery pain as warmth returned to them, a pain that was a welcome affirmation of life. She stood, her legs unsteady, and looked around the small, sparse cabin. It was a man's space, functional and stark. A bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves holding tins and sacks of flour, and the great stone hearth that dominated the room. It was a shelter, a fortress. She moved toward the kitchen area, her bare feet silent on the rough-hewn floorboards. His supplies were meager but organized. Flour, beans, salt pork, dried apples, a sack of potatoes. Without a sound, she began to work. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, her hands finding a rhythm in the simple tasks of kneading dough and slicing potatoes. The sun was just beginning to touch the highest peaks when Caleb awoke to a smell he hadn't experienced in years. It was not the familiar scent of burning bacon or watery coffee, but the rich, warm aroma of baking bread and simmering stew. He sat up, his joints cracking in protest, and saw her by the hearth, her back to him. She had found a crate to sit on, and she was stirring the pot with a wooden spoon, the firelight catching the blue-black shine of her hair. A plate was set on the table, holding a piece of golden-brown bread and a steaming bowl of stew. He hadn't told her to do this. He hadn't asked. He had simply brought her in from the cold, and she had answered the sign. They settled into a strange, silent rhythm. Each morning, Caleb would rise before dawn and head out into the frozen world to tend his traps and chop wood, his breath pluming in the frigid air. When he returned, chilled to the bone, the cabin would be warm, a welcome sanctuary against the biting wind. The air inside would be thick with the scent of her cooking, sometimes a hearty stew, sometimes savory cakes made from cornmeal and wild onions she found dried in the pantry. She transformed his crude supplies into meals that were not just sustenance, but a deep, quiet comfort. He never knew what she would make, but it was always nourishing, always hot. An Lee, for her part, moved through the small space with a ghost-like grace. She cleaned the cabin until the single window pane gleamed, and the wooden floors were free of the grime of years of neglect. She mended his torn shirts with tiny, meticulous stitches that were nearly invisible. She was a constant, quiet presence, a gentle hum of purpose in the overwhelming silence of his life. One evening, he came in to find her shivering by the fire, her thin pink dress hopelessly inadequate. Her feet, though healing, were still bare. He said nothing, but after their meal he went to his trunk and pulled out a pair of thick wool socks, worn at the heel but clean. He placed them on the hearthstone near her, a clumsy, unspoken offering. He turned away quickly, feeling a strange heat on his neck, as if he'd revealed some hidden part of himself. The next morning she was wearing them. They were ridiculously large on her small feet, but she had folded the tops down neatly. A few days later he returned to find a small bowl of hot broth waiting for him on the table, steam rising in a fragrant cloud. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a conversation, the first real one they'd had. He drank it slowly, the warmth spreading through him, a warmth that had little to do with the temperature. The need for supplies became unavoidable. The flour sack was nearly empty, and he was low on salt and coffee. The trip to the settlement of Jasper's Fork was a full day's journey down the mountain, a journey he always made with a sense of grim necessity. This time, the thought filled him with a cold dread. He couldn't leave her alone for 2 days. The wilderness was unforgiving, and the cabin, for all its sturdiness, was not impenetrable. But the idea of taking her with him was somehow worse. He imagined the stares, the sneering questions, the raw, brutish curiosity of the men in the town. He saw the way they looked at anything, or anyone, they considered foreign, fragile, or female. He watched her as she swept the hearth, her movements fluid and focused, and knew he couldn't subject her to that. Yet, he couldn't leave her. The dilemma gnawed at him for 2 days before he made his decision. "We're going to town," he announced one morning, his voice rough. An Li looked up from the bread she was kneading, her dark eyes questioning but not afraid. She simply nodded, wiped her hands, and went to fetch the thin shawl that was her only outer garment. He saddled his horse, the big, steady beast named Boulder, and lifted her up to sit in front of him. She was light as a feather, and he wrapped a heavy horse blanket around her small shoulders, his arm circling her waist to keep her steady. The warmth of her body against his was a strange and unsettling comfort. In Jasper's Fork, it was exactly as he had feared. Heads turned as they rode down the muddy, half-frozen Main Street. Faces appeared in windows, and conversations in the saloon quieted, replaced by murmurs and hostile glares. At the general store, the proprietor, a sour-faced man named Jedediah, looked An Li up and down with open contempt. "Found yourself a new pet, Caleb?" he sneered. Caleb felt a surge of cold fury. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped in front of An Li, shielding her, his sheer size a silent, menacing warning. Jedediah's smirk faltered. Caleb bought his flour, his salt, and his coffee. Then he walked over to the stack of ready-made clothes. He picked out the warmest wool cloak in the store, a deep forest green, and a pair of sturdy leather boots, small enough to fit her. He paid in silence, his gaze never leaving Jedediah's, daring him to say another word. Outside, he handed the items to An Li. She looked at the boots, her expression unreadable, then sat on the porch steps and, after pulling off the big wool socks, slipped her feet into them. It was the first time he had seen her in proper footwear. It felt like a victory. They made it back to the cabin just as the sky turned a bruised, ominous purple, and the first flakes of a new snow began to fall. By nightfall, it was a blizzard. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin like a hungry beast, and the snow came down in a blinding horizontal sheet. Caleb had seen storms, but this was different. This was a siege. The world outside vanished, replaced by a swirling vortex of white. The temperature plummeted. He worked tirelessly, banking snow against the north wall for insulation, checking the seal on the door and keeping the fire roaring, feeding it log after log from the massive pile he had stacked inside. The cabin, which had once felt spacious in his solitude, was now a tiny, fragile raft in a raging sea. The storm erased the distance between them. They moved around each other in the cramped space, their shoulders brushing, their tasks overlapping. They worked as a team, wordlessly. She kept a pot of water melting on the hearth and made sure he had hot coffee, while he secured the shutter on the window that threatened to tear loose from its leather hinges. For 3 days the storm howled. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin, the circle of firelight, and the two of them. The constant deafening roar of the wind made conversation impossible, but in the shared struggle for survival they spoke a more profound language. He watched her as she sat by the fire, her face illuminated by the flames, wearing the new green cloak he'd bought her. She looked small and out of place, and yet she possessed a stillness, a core of resilience that fascinated him. She was not panicking. She was not weeping. She was simply present, weathering the storm with the same quiet endurance as the ancient pines outside. In the heart of the blizzard, trapped and isolated, Caleb realized he was not afraid. For the first time in years, he was not alone in the face of the mountain's fury, and that made all the difference. On the 3rd night, the wind finally began to die down, its furious shriek softening to a mournful moan. The silence that followed was immense, heavy with the weight of fallen snow. The fire crackled in the hearth, a warm and steady heartbeat in the quiet dark. They sat on the bearskin rug, sharing a plate of beans and dried meat, the last of their fresh supplies. The forced intimacy of the storm had stripped away the last of their reservations. It was An Li who spoke first, her voice soft in the stillness. "They were building the railroad," she said, looking into the flames. "My father, my brother, they promised a new life." Caleb listened, not moving, not wanting to break the fragile thread of her words. She spoke in a careful, halting English, but her meaning was clear. She told him of the brutal work, the cruelty of the foreman, the sickness that took her father. She spoke of her brother's defiance and the terrible price he paid for it. And she spoke of her escape, a desperate flight into the wilderness with nothing but the dress she wore, running until she could run no more, until she had found his sign and simply stopped, ready for the end. "I did not think I would wake up," she finished, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb was quiet for a long time, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. He thought of the life he had fled, the neat clapboard house, the laughter that had once filled it. "I had a wife," he said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth, "and a daughter. Fever took 'em, both in a week." He hadn't spoken their names aloud in 5 years. I thought if I came somewhere this big, this empty, the hole they left might not seem so large. But it is. The silence just makes it louder." He looked at her then, at her dark, compassionate eyes, and saw not pity, but understanding. They were 2 survivors, 2 lonely souls who had washed up on the same desolate shore, each bearing the scars of a different storm. The world had broken them both, and in that shared brokenness they found an unexpected solace. The morning dawned clear and painfully bright. A new world lay outside the window, sculpted from snow and ice, pristine and silent under a pale blue sky. Caleb pushed the door open, the deep drift of snow sighing as it gave way. The air was so cold it felt sharp in his lungs, but it was clean, fresh. The storm was over. An Li came to stand beside him in the doorway, wrapped in her green cloak. They looked out at the transformed landscape together. The mountains were sharp and brilliant against the sky, every tree branch laden with a heavy coat of white. The world felt scrubbed clean, reborn. After all the noise and violence of the storm, the peace was profound. He felt a shift inside himself, a settling of old ghosts. The silence no longer felt empty, it felt peaceful. He turned to look at her. The bright morning light caught the side of her face, illuminating the fine lines of her cheekbone, the soft curve of her mouth. She was looking out at the snow, a small, wondrous smile on her lips. In that moment, she was not a refugee, not a victim, not just his cook. She was just An Li, strong, resilient, beautiful. An instinct he had buried long ago rose within him, a simple human need for connection. He slowly raised his hand, his rough, calloused fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently brushed a stray strand of black hair from her cheek. It was a feather-like touch, tentative and questioning. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his. Her dark eyes were soft, questioning, but held no fear. She leaned into his touch, a barely perceptible movement, an acceptance. A warmth spread through Caleb's chest, a feeling so unfamiliar it almost frightened him. It was more than gratitude, more than companionship. He realized with a startling clarity that the sign he had hammered into the frozen ground had not been a request for a cook. It had been a prayer, sent out into the vast, indifferent wilderness. And somehow, impossibly, she had been the answer. Life found a new rhythm, one marked not by silence and solitude, but by shared tasks and quiet companionship. The cabin, once a mere shelter from the elements, became a home. It was a place of warmth and light against the vast, cold emptiness of the mountains. One afternoon, Caleb took the crude "Cook Wanted" sign down from the path. He carried the weathered plank back to the cabin, broke it over his knee with a sharp crack, and fed the pieces to the fire. An-Li watched him from her seat by the hearth where she was mending one of his gloves. She said nothing, but a small, knowing smile touched her lips. The sign's purpose had been served. Its promise had been fulfilled in ways neither of them could have ever imagined. Their days were filled with simple things. He taught her the names of the constellations he could see from their porch on clear nights. She taught him how to cook rice so it was perfectly fluffy, and how to use the wild ginger root she found growing near the creek. He would return from his work to find she had left his worn boots by the fire to warm, and she would wake to find he had already filled the water buckets, saving her the trip to the icy creek. Their love was not a thing of grand pronouncements or passionate declarations. It was built in the quiet spaces between words, in 1,000 small gestures of care. It was in the way he would instinctively move to stand between her and any perceived threat, and the way her presence soothed the jagged edges of his soul. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, he sat beside her at the hearth. She was reading a worn book he owned, her brow furrowed in concentration. He reached out and gently took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, a perfect fit. He looked at their joined hands, his large, scarred and weathered, hers small, delicate, yet strong. They were a testament to the lives they had lived, the hardships they had endured. They were survivors who had found in each other not a cure for their old wounds, but a safe harbor in which to heal. The mountains were still vast and the winters still harsh, but inside the small log cabin, two lonely souls had built a world of their own, a quiet kingdom of two.